This is Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood.
Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Beth Chewning. My husband, Matt, is the lead pastor here. Thank you. We moved about 5 years ago with our 4 kids from North Carolina to plant this church, and I never thought in a million years that I would ever agree to get up here and speak, so this is really insane for me. But it was kind of exciting to think that after 5 years of being Matt's sermon illustration, that it'd be fun to turn the tables on him a little bit. So when Matt asked me to do this a couple months ago, I told him I would think about it, but only because he really wanted me to, but I had no intention of ever really saying yes. I am super shy. I have been my whole life, and I have like a threshold of people I feel comfortable talking in front of, and it's like 4 people. So last month, me and Matt had to travel for work for some church stuff, and we ended up in Ohio at a conference, and I sat under this preacher, and they were saying, like, if God puts something in front of you, you have to be obedient to what he's calling you to do. And so my mind went to, well, I don't really think God is calling me to do this. I think it's just Matt. Because I could think of a ton of other people that should be up here, not me. But then a week later, we ended up going to a completely different conference, unrelated to the first, different speaker, and crazy enough, it was like the same message, but with a twist. And so this time, the person was like, if God wants you to do something, if he's placed something in front of you, even if you feel inadequate, even if you feel like you're not the right person, you need to be obedient to what God is calling you to do. And I was like, oh, all right. Okay, God. So just know that this is very scary for me. I do feel inadequate, but I'm just trying to be obedient to what the Lord has called me to do. So today we're in the last week of a series called My Journey. We've had 3 different people come up and share their stories. The first week was Melissa Chang. The second week was David Anastasi, and last week was Joe Moranti, and they all did a really amazing job sharing their stories of sanctification. And sanctification is just like a fancy word that means the process that Christians are on as we become more like Jesus. So today I'm going to tell you my story, but one thing that I would like for you to know before I start is that I love reading books. And then when I'm done reading the book, being able to watch a movie, because I've like imagined this whole story in my head, and then to be able to see it in pictures is awesome. So I decided to change things up a bit today, and I'm going to illustrate my story with a few pictures for you guys. So just a warning. So, you know, when you're a believer, it's not uncommon to be asked the question, like, when did you become a Christian? Like, tell me your testimony. And there's a few different ways that this could be answered. One way is that people have this like amazing story. They know exactly when they were saved, the date, the time, like what they were wearing. They have like this amazing story, and everybody ends up crying at the end of it. And then you have a different way where it's just like, oh, I'm not really sure when I became a Christian. Like, I just remember believing one day. Or another way, like, oh, I've just been a Christian my whole life. And that's my story. Just been a Christian my whole life, although I know that that's theologically wrong. Like, we're all born sinners, but I was really, really young when I got saved. So probably like about that age. That's little me. So because I was a Christian most of my life, like I always shied away from telling my testimony because it kind of felt boring to me. There was nothing like, no huge circumstances that happened that led me to become a Christian. But as I've gotten older, I can see the beauty in every single story of somebody coming from death to life. And the fact that I have been a Christian most of my life is pretty awesome. But it didn't mean that everything was perfect. It didn't mean that I didn't struggle, because as Christians, we all still struggle with sin. So as I was preparing to talk to you guys today, it was really clear to me where most of my struggles my whole life have come from. And I think it was that I was born with this disease to please. My whole life, I have found my identity in wanting people to be happy with me or caring about what people think about me. So I grew up the baby in my family. There we are. I have an older brother, Paul, who lives in Salem. He actually goes to Netcast, is on the worship team. My older sister, Jen, lives in North Carolina, but she's actually moving next month to Danvers, and it'll be the first time in over 15 years that we've all lived really close to each other, which is awesome. So the three of us grew up PKs, and if you don't know what that stands for, it stands for a pastor's kid. My dad growing up was a Nazarene pastor. And the thing about PKs, if you've never heard of it, like we have this reputation for being known to end up the bad kids. So, when we got a little older, you can kind of see the sass on my brother and sister's faces. They decided to take seriously this reputation of ending up being bad, and they got into a ton of trouble. And I could go into details, but it's not my story to tell, but just know that they got in a lot of trouble, and my parents were living very stressed and overwhelmed. So from an early age, it meant everything to me to make my parents happy, to be a good girl, to be a good listener, to never talk back, to be helpful. My parents nicknamed me their baby girl, their little angel, and when they would introduce me to people, they'd be like, "This is our little baby girl, she never ever gets in trouble." And my brother and sister also had a nickname for me, though, and they called me the little brown noser. So I definitely, though, wasn't always perfect. I tested the boundaries a little bit. Right before about high school, this is embarrassing, but I was going through a hippie grunge, choker necklace, bell-bottom phase. I wish I had a better picture, but that somewhat can show you what I was going through. So it was a Sunday morning, and I decided, I want to dye my hair. But I was a kid, I didn't have money, so I went in the kitchen and got a packet of Kool-Aid. So if you don't know, Kool-Aid can actually dye your hair, but I picked grape Kool-Aid, and I dyed my hair bright purple, like Barney the dinosaur purple. And so my parents were at church. We lived in the parsonage, so I just walked to church, and my dad was out front, greeting people to walk into church. And so, he kind of, catches, glance of me, and he's just turn around and go home and wash that right out. He was mortified that I had purple hair, and I was mortified that I made him mortified because I had this good girl complex. So as I got older, though, it wasn't just, my parents that I wanted to make happy with me. It became then my friends when I went off to college, what they thought of me mattered. And so Matt and I met my sophomore year in college. It was his freshman year. And I know that he's told this story a ton of times from stage, but he wasn't a Christian when we first got to college. But part of the story that he probably hasn't shared as much is just what type of person he really was. So he was seriously such a punk. He would walk around campus thinking that he owned the place. He was mean to people. I did not like him. It was not love at first sight, I can promise you that. But I remember being in our college dugout, and I remember the night that he got saved, clearly in my mind. He came in, and he had this huge smile on his face, and he was just telling everybody, I got saved tonight. I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus. And I literally saw him turn into a new person, which was pretty awesome. We began dating shortly after that, and here's a 1-month anniversary picture, which I don't know if it's cute that we were celebrating 1 month or if it's corny, but that is 1 month of dating. So my friends, though, really did not agree with me dating him because honestly, he was a punk. He was really known in our college for not fitting in. And my brother actually wrote me a letter, and it was your brother gets stern with you. He was I don't want you hanging out with that kid. I don't want you hanging out with him. So nobody could understand why this good girl chose to be with this bad kid. But I think looking back, it's just clear that I have a really good judge of character. I love you, baby. But sadly, I actually, most of my friends that didn't agree with it, they weren't my friends anymore, which was sad to this girl that sought so much approval from people. So from there, I put everything into Matt. I wanted to be the perfect girlfriend, and I wanted to make him happy. He became my newest idol. Before you know it, we were married. There's our wedding picture. Sorry, I have to take. And ever since I was a little girl, all I wanted to be was a mom. When people asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I was I just want to be a mom. So me and Matt were super excited when Daniel was born. There we are, little Daniel. And one thing about me and Matt is that like we would just look at each other and get pregnant, so we ended up having 3 more fairly quickly. So but once we had kids, my validation didn't just come from being known. It also then added, I wanted to be known as a great mom. It's always been so hard for me not to find my identity wrapped up in our family or what people think about me. Because I want to be known as a good mom. I want to be known as a good wife, a good friend, a good daughter. I want my kids looking cute when we go out in public, and I definitely want them behaving. When someone compliments me on anything, it can like make my whole entire day. But if I get criticized for something, like I could be crushed, like out for the count. Since it's impossible for us to find our validation in people, I then decided to start looking into things, which is like so stupid. And this story that I'm about to tell is kind of embarrassing. But so when me and Matt moved from Boston to North Carolina, we only had 1 car. And when we lived in North Carolina, though, it was like country. So Matt would go off to work with the car, and I'd be stuck home with the kids for like 8 to 10 hours a day. You couldn't even walk anywhere. You were in the middle of nowhere. So when I found out we were pregnant with our 3rd, we were like, we have to get another car. We have to get a van. But at the time, we were doing Dave Ramsey, who's like a financial management person, who says, like, don't buy anything unless you have the cash to buy it. So our neighbor down the street was selling a van, and he sold it to us for $600 cash, which was awesome because we had it and we paid for it. But the thing that you need to know about this van was like it was a straight hoopty. Like seriously. When I would go to make turns like in an intersection going under 10 miles an hour, like my car would just stall and die. So I'd be like stuck in the intersection having to like quick turn it back on and go. Like the speedometer was broken, but only by a little bit, and I found this out the very first day I drove it because I got my first speeding ticket ever. The windows were broken, they wouldn't roll down, so when I went to the drive-thru, I'd have to like pull my van up just to the right place to be able to open the door and like exchange whatever it is I was doing. I remember like literally being horrified as I'd have to go through the preschool pickup line and pick up my kids because my car would keep stalling. And so for me, I'm looking at all these other moms and I think they're just like staring at this crazy car and I'm staring at them and all their beautiful cars. But somehow, like, it's sad to say this, but I was like embarrassed by this car. I think maybe I thought I deserved better. And I somehow let this van shape my identity, which is just crazy. So I have so many other stories that I could tell you about this disease to please and how I struggle with where I find my identity. But I think I'm not alone in this. Being in ministry now for so many years, like I know a lot of you out there, and I've actually talked to a bunch of you about this, and a lot of us struggle with this. It's because we're sinners and we live in a sinful world. We all have the tendency to look to people for approval and validation, security and comfort, people like our spouses, our friends, our bosses, or our children. This is why we get so embarrassed when we're in public and our kids start having like a tantrum. This is why we want our house looking so cute when people come over, and it has to be perfectly cleaned as well. And it's super sad to me because sometimes I'll just be cleaning my house for no reason. My kids come up and they're like, "Who's coming over tonight?" Like, no guys, I was just cleaning the house. So we love the approval and validation of others. We all struggle trying to come across as the best to other people rather than being content with God's best. And the truth is, I can only see this in myself by how I respond when things go badly. Like, what happens to us when we're overlooked? What happens to us when we're not on that invite list that everybody else is on? What happens when people criticize you? What happens when we're squeezed? Like, what comes out of us when we're squeezed for any number of reasons? Because when things go bad, and they will go bad because it's life, how do we respond? Do you get defensive? Do you get angry? Do you just want to quit? Do you say things like, "I can't do this anymore. I'm a terrible parent. I'm worthless. I'm a failure. I feel isolated and alone." And I've caught myself even saying, like, "Why, God, would you allow certain things to happen to me?" So, this was really huge for me last year. Last year was probably one of the hardest years of my life. So to start the year, my grandfather passed away. And then people that I loved, multiple people that I loved, really failed me and hurt me. And I felt really, really alone. I had placed these unreasonable expectations on our family, and when they didn't happen, I felt like a failure. My mom, who struggled with severe depression her whole life, was at a really, really low point, and she had to be hospitalized for a long time. And I was even struggling with how I fit into Netcast. So when Netcast first started, it was just me and Matt. Like, Netcast office was in our living room. We made all the decisions together. And then as we grew, though, which is awesome, we had to start hiring people, which was great. But then we had staff and people running things, and I just started to feel like I wasn't needed anymore. And I was really struggling with just my place. And it just felt like last year, thing after thing after thing after thing was happening, and it was just a really hard year. And I remember telling one of my best friends, trying to explain to her what it felt like for me. And in my mind, it just felt like I was in the middle of the ocean, and I was swimming, and I was just trying my hardest to stay afloat, but it was like a terrible storm, and these huge waves just kept crashing on me, and it would drag me under, and I couldn't breathe. And I would try to get up, and as soon as I would get up and take just a little breath, like another wave would just bring me right down again. So I remember telling Matt, like, I feel worthless. It was a really hard year. But listen, that's a problem for us as Christians when we get to that place, because we're literally not believing the gospel in our lives. I have a devotional by Paul Tripp, who's an amazing author, if you've never heard of him, and he describes this problem that we all have perfectly. He says, "What's the problem that I'm fretting about? It's the fact that so many of us have a huge dark hole in the middle of our gospel. Sure, we have a pretty good understanding of the gospel past, the forgiveness that we have received through the sacrifice of Jesus, and a fairly clear understanding of the salvation future, the eternity that we will spend with Jesus, but have we really understood well the benefits of the work of Christ in the here and in the now?" And my answer to that would be no. Like, I struggle daily to understand the gospel with how it applies to my life in the here and now. I still find myself so worried about what people think about me rather than believing what Jesus says about me. He says I'm his perfect creation. He says that I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And he says he will never leave me or forsake me. But why is it that I can still feel worthless and still feel alone? What is the answer to this problem? Like, how do I fight to remember that my identity is wrapped in the fact that I'm a child of God? How to remember that Jesus didn't just save us, but he's saving us every single day? How to remember that the Lord is not done with us? And I think Hebrews is a great book to look at, to refocus our eyes on the truth. So we're going to read Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 4, but before we get started, I just want to give you a context of Hebrews. So Hebrews was written between 60 and 70 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. The author of Hebrews is unknown, but it was thought to be the pastor at the time because Hebrews is written in like a sermon form. It was really odd to believe in Jesus at that time because most of the people in Rome believed in like many gods. They worshiped many idols. They even had a statue in the center of their city that was engraved to the unknown God because they wanted to make sure like they covered all their bases. Like, oops, if we forgot one, here's the unknown one. And Christians believe that Jesus was the only way. And the emperor at the time was Nero, and he was super threatened by Christians because they kept talking about this new king coming. And Nero was also just like psycho. He decided that it would be a good idea to feed Christians to lions, have dogs attacking them, crucifying them, and setting them on fire. Like, could you imagine being a Christian at that time? Like, those Christians must have been so scared. They were really suffering. They were overwhelmed. They were exhausted, and they were super tired. So the writer of Hebrews wants to encourage them to endure by taking their eyes off of their circumstances. So let's look at Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 4. Verse 1 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses," the author is saying, therefore, what is this therefore? We have to look back. Let's remember who has come before you. Because in Hebrews 11, the author lays out this massive list of believers who had endured these crazy circumstances, yet they stayed faithful. People like Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. So the writer is telling us to learn from the Christians who have been tested, but yet they finished well. And so since we have this massive history of faithful believers who have come before us, Hebrews says, "Let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely." Lay aside every weight is implying that there are things that are weighing us down. And sin is so subtle, yet it clings to us. Like, a lot of times we're blinded by our sin. So can you imagine having to run a race after you've been just like dunked in a pool in a full outfit? Like sweatshirt, jeans, tennis shoes, like the water would weigh the clothes down. It would be super heavy. It would be so hard, but that's not saying you couldn't finish the race. You could still do it. It would just be a lot harder, and it would take you longer to where you wanted to go. And in the same way, we have the choice in the here and now on how we're running our race. Like, what are the things that are weighing us down? What's robbing us from our time with Christ? Is it work? Is it trying to achieve certain things? Is it certain relationships? I think distractions are huge for us in this day and age, like our cell phones. They're just constantly on us. It's a huge distraction. And I know for me, it's also just the pace of life that I've created. From the second I get up in the morning, I'm just running hard all day long until I lay my head on the pillow. But at the end of the day, was the things that I was running towards, were those the right things? This is where we all just have to search our hearts for the things that distract us and consume us and take our focus off of Jesus. We're told to lay it aside, to throw it off. Whatever it is, we have to just get rid of it. So to continue in Hebrews, it says, "And let us run," or sprint, "with endurance until the end, the race that is set before us." So our Christian life is like an assigned race, and our races are going to be so different, but regardless of what they look like, we have to run with the intention of giving it everything we have without slowing down until we finish. And verse 2 is the key in knowing how to do this. So verse 2 says, "Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." So my problem isn't necessarily in what I'm doing, but it's in what I'm looking at. It's saying if I saw correctly, I would be able to run correctly. Our problem is we spend so much time focused on the crowd around us rather than looking to Jesus, who's already won the race. It's saying in the midst of the journey, we can have joy because our eyes are fixed on Jesus, and he is the one that gives us our joy. So one thing about Matt, I was going to share another little story, is he's kind of a terrible driver. Wherever Matt's eyes go in the car, that's where the car goes. So if he's changing the radio or putting the AC on, we're starting to swerve a little bit. And if you're driving on the highway and you see an accident on the other side, I'm we're gonna get in an accident because we are swerving so much. When he takes his eyes off of the road, the whole car leans wherever he looks. And I'm constantly yelling at him, "Matt, watch the road." But that's what we do with our own race, right? As our eyes come off of Jesus, our hearts begin to swerve towards whatever it is that we're looking at. So verse 3 says to consider him. Sure, life isn't easy. Sometimes people fail us, they hurt us, and we're treated wrongly, but we're called to consider Jesus, to be reminded of Jesus, and to look to Jesus, who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. And that sounds good, but sometimes, honestly, we still are struggling, right? So to look at verse 4, it says, "In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted yet to the point of shedding your blood." So in other words, we have to put our stories in perspective. We all can make excuses about how hard life is, but think about this. We've shed some tears, but have any of us ever had to shed blood? And I'm not trying to minimize the journey that we're on, because I know it can be hard, but we're not Jesus, and we're not hanging on a cross dying for the sins of the world. So I am super bad at exercising. When you go to your annual physical and your doctor's "So what do you do for exercise?" I'm always "Oh, well, I have 4 kids. I take care of them." And I'll also be the first to tell you that I'm not a runner at all. In college, Matt played basketball, and he'd have to run a bunch, and he would be "Come running with me." And I'd be "Oh, no, I can't. I have bad lungs." So I knew I knew what I meant in my mind when I said that, but Matt legit thought I had a medical condition. It wasn't until a year or so later that he really understood that I wasn't sick, I was just out of shape. So a couple months after we moved here, it's a new start. I was I think I'm gonna try to get in shape. Maybe I'll be a runner. And I signed up for my first 5K. My goal obviously wasn't to place. I knew that was not gonna happen, but I just wanted to finish. I wanted to be I finished this race. When we got there, I got my number. The kids came and Matt, and they got off on the side, and they were gonna cheer me on, and it was exciting. And so I go get in the line, and I'm waiting for the race to start. And what do? I start looking around and seeing what my competition is, because that's what I do, comparing. And as I'm looking at these people, I'm oh my goodness, these people are professional runners. They've got these awesome outfits, their thick calf leg muscles, and I was like, oh boy, I'm gonna definitely come in last place. So as I'm thinking this though, I see this 70-year-old man like entering where we're all standing to start the race. And this poor man, like he had a gimp in his leg, but he was legit like dragging his leg along. And I was like, oh, that is so precious that this man is like still gonna try to run this race. Like that's awesome. And then I was like, oh, thank you, Jesus, I'm not gonna come in last place. So I put my earbuds in and like the gun goes off, we start the race. My first mile, I'm thinking like, yes, I got this. This is like easy. This is feeling good. I'm keeping my good pace. Second mile comes and like, I'm not dying yet, but I'm thinking like, why in the world is this race so hilly? Like I was not prepared to run all of these hills. And then third mile comes and I'm really starting to struggle and I'm starting to believe that I do have a medical condition because my lungs are burning. I cannot breathe and I feel like I'm dying. And so as I'm thinking about stopping, I see someone approaching from my left. And can anybody guess who that might have been? I affectionately call him Gimpy, but this 70-year-old man was legit passing me, dragging his leg. So something inside me like welled up, and I was like, no, Beth, no, no, no. You have got to beat this man. And so I just kept running. Before you know it, I could see the finish line. I could see Matt and the kids there like cheering me on. They're like, come on, honey. And I could see Matt's face as I get closer, and he's like looking at me running, and then he's looking over at like Gimpy. And then he looks at me again, and he looks over at Gimpy, and I know Matt well enough to know in his mind, he's like, oh, babe, don't let him beat you. But there was absolutely nothing I could do to catch up to this old limping 5K pro, because he totally beat me. But listen, this is exactly what Hebrews 12 was talking about, because when I started that race, my goal was to finish, it was to endure, it was to give it everything I had, but the race started to get hard, so my focus shifted, my body started to hurt, and when mile 3 came, I wanted to quit. Like, the thought of having to go up another hill was like, no, I couldn't do it. So I stopped focusing on the finish line, and I was focusing on my circumstances. I was complaining, I was exhausted. Then this man, who has obviously been through far worse than me, passes me and catches my eye. And just like Jesus, this man never slowed down, he never quit, and he was certainly not making excuses. And as my eyes stopped focusing on myself, I started to focus on this man. And as I watched him finish this race well, I realized that I was still running. I never slowed down and I didn't quit, and I ended up finishing actually pretty well. So having my eyes focused on the proper thing gave me the proper inspiration to finish. And that is what happens to us as Christians, though. When we take our eyes off of Jesus, we become so self-focused that we almost see nothing other than our personal circumstances. We find ourselves complaining and frustrated and tired, exhausted, wondering what people think about us and trying to find our validation in others and our accomplishments. And we start comparing ourselves to people around us. And every race is unique. Some are going to be easier than others, some are going to be harder than others, but it's not about anybody's race but the one that's right in front of you. It's about your race. When we take our eyes off of our race and start comparing to others, we lose focus. And comparison is the thief of joy. How many times in my life have I made the comment like, if only? Like I've said, if only planting a church on the North Shore could be as easy as planting in the South, like that'd be awesome. If only my mom could be cured of her depression. If only our family could look like that family. Or if only I had that certain thing, or if only I didn't have this certain thing. But the truth is that Jesus never promises us an easy race. It's actually running up those hills that we're sanctified. It's through the hard times that we become more like Jesus. And Jesus promises to never leave us. In Matthew 11, Jesus compares the Christian life to a yoke, and he says, take my yoke upon you. So a yoke is just a long piece of wood that lays over like the neck back of a cow, and there's like a harness where their heads go in. And I think it's really cool to picture this yoke because that cow is not alone. Like there's always another cow harnessed in next to him as they carry this load. And a yoke is also used to keep them going. It's a form of slavery because if they didn't have that on them, they would wander away. And the Lord knows that we're prone to wander as well. He never intended us to live on our own, being slaves to our sin nature is a huge weight to carry. Jesus intends for us to live by the power of his Holy Spirit, focusing our eyes on him. His yoke is easy and his burden is light. And when we're focused on Jesus, he carries the load for us. So when our eyes can see his beauty, his power, his grace, and his purpose, his plans, and all that he has accomplished, it's in those moments that we are inspired to run our race well. When our eyes are focused on Jesus, we can trust him with the race that he's handpicked for us, even if we don't understand it. When we're running with our eyes focused correctly, we want to worship Jesus, sing to Jesus, talk to Jesus, and share Jesus. And it's not because we have to, but that's what happens when Christians see properly. That's what happens when our perspective is right. It's because we're seeing right. So this is my journey that I shared with you today, my own race that God handpicked for me. What does your race look like? Some of us are running our races well, and some of us in here are really struggling and we feel like we're limping along. And some of us in here aren't even in the race yet. Once we believe in Jesus, we're immediately put into the race. Becoming a Christian is simple. It's just believe that Jesus died and rose again for our sins. I'm definitely not a pastor. I'm not a theologian, and I don't have fancy words for why I believe. I trusted in Jesus as a young child, but I can see Christ growing me every day, and I can see such a difference when I choose to follow Jesus over choosing to follow myself. There's such a joy that never fades when we take our eyes off of ourselves and focus them onto Jesus. And this is why Jesus died, so that we might have joy as we believe in the gospel. You don't need to say a special prayer. You just look to Jesus and believe and run. So when me and Matt are asked how many kids we have, we obviously say 4. But sometimes we'll joke with each other and say that it feels like we have 5 kids. Because, see, Netcast was a vision that God gave us. And we've been praying and loving Netcast since before we even moved here. Just like we want certain things for our kids, these are the things that I want for our church and the people in our church. I want us to run the race that God has for us well, not looking to other people or comparing. I want us to endure and never give up. I want us to love when it's really hard to. I want us to be generous when it makes no sense at all. And I want us to take huge leaps of faith. And most importantly, I want us to keep our eyes on Jesus because it's really just all about him. And I want us to finish well. So in closing, I'm going to read Philippians 3, 12 through 15. It's the Message version, which is just a contemporary language written by Eugene Peterson. So the Apostle Paul says, I'm not saying that I have this all together, that I have it made, but I am well on my way, reaching out for Christ who has so wondrously reached out for me. Friends, don't get me wrong. By no means do I count myself an expert in all of this, but I've got my eye on the goal, where God is beckoning us onward to Jesus. I'm off and I'm running, and I'm not turning back. So let's keep focused on that goal, those of us who want everything that God has for us. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we really love you. Thank you for being such a loving Father who is so patient with us as we struggle to run our races well sometimes. I pray that you would just help each and every one of us in here today to keep our eyes focused on